In Paris, Elena Casas-Montanez. Elena, good evening and thank you for joining us on The Globe.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Elena, what can we expect from this meeting, from what French President Emmanuel Macron has basically come out to say that they need French support with the soldiers that are on the ground in the Sahel region?
So we've heard from President Macron and the 5 leaders of the Sahel countries just in the last few minutes, and they've released a joint communiqué on the conclusion of that summit. Now, the communiqué says that those countries remain supportive and grateful for the French military engagement in the region. French troops, of course, have been on the ground for the last 7 years, and they have been controversial in some countries, as we were hearing there. There have been widespread protests, particularly in Mali, against the presence of French troops. France's relationship, of course, with some of its former colonies in Africa remains quite complex, but the presidents were saying that they very much support the French engagement in the region and that they plan to deepen and continue their joint collaborative efforts to fight Islamist terror groups, particularly the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, as the group calls itself, in the months and years to come. They also promised to step up development aid to countries in the Sahel. They promised to reinforce military training for countries in the Sahel region for their own armies. There is a military training program run jointly by France and Germany, which already exists, but some of that engagement will be stepped up, President Macron was saying, and he also said there will be newfound efforts to re-establish the rule of law in parts of the Sahel region, which essentially are beyond the control of their governments, particularly in the Kidal region of eastern Mali, which has essentially been out of the control of the Malian government since it was first overrun by Islamist-inspired groups almost 7 years ago in 2013. So they are going to try and push to try and get things like law courts and a justice system in place in that region so it can once again come under the rule of law.
Now, the head of the European Commission and that of the African Union were also invited to join the talks. What's the significance of the involvement of such broad parties at these talks?
Well, France is very clear that it needs more involvement in the fight against Islamist terror groups in the Sahel from other European countries and from the US. In the joint communiqué, it specifically states that the countries consider US support, US financial aid towards the fight against terror groups in the Sahel to be hugely important, and that they very much hope it continues. There was no representative from the US at this meeting, though, and they are deeply concerned that the Trump administration wants to withdraw US financial support for the fight against terror groups in the Sahel. So that is an active concern, and they're hoping also that some of that support can be replaced by financial and practical support in terms of troop training, for example, from other EU countries. Germany is already involved in doing this, and they're hoping to attract wider support from other European Union countries.
Now, some of the presidents, for instance, Mali's Keita, saying that talks would allow them to put on the table all the questions and grievances and all solutions that they all may have to bring forward. You know, what sort of feeling was the meeting on in terms of all the leaders and you know, with the resolutions going forward and the fact that France does need assistance not only from you know, the African Union or the EU, but from the global leaders as a whole, because the Sahel region is engulfed by jihadist militants, and France has been there for the longest time, but they do need assistance. Is that the sentiment that's going around?
Yes, I think it's clear absolutely that the Sahel countries feel that they've been left alone for too long with insufficient international support to try and deal with the scale of the Islamist-inspired menace that they're trying to fight. Of course, simply geographically, the scale of land involved in the Sahara is vast, and much of it is an almost empty desert where it's very difficult to track terrorist groups or to be able to predict where they might be in advance. So it is something that affects the security of the whole of Africa and indeed the security of Europe, of course, because the more instability there is in the Sahel, the more That spreads north into Libya, and also the more that many of these terror groups are also engaged in the trafficking of people who are seeking to reach Europe, which is of course something that the European Union is seeking to prevent, is seeking to end. So the Sahel countries are very keen to make the point that the security of their region is relevant not just to them but to everyone, and that they need a wider global commitment to tackling it.
In terms of the numbers of soldiers that France has sent through to the Sahel region, is this enough? Do they need in terms of more numbers? And with the lives that have been lost, are they losing this fight against jihadists?
There's notably no mention in this communiqué of an increase in the number of French troops in the Sahel, which is about 4,500 at the moment. That military intervention is controversial here in France, especially after the death of 13 French soldiers in a helicopter crash just before Christmas. And there had been speculation here in France that Emmanuel Macron was seeking to pull out French troops, something that the French government has absolutely denied. But there is certainly also no increase in the number of troops going to the region. Are they losing the battle against jihadi groups? Well, it's a difficult question. The leaders at the Sahel conference that's going on at the moment have been admitting that 2019 was a particularly difficult year in the region. Across the Sahel, about 1,500 civilians were killed by jihadi terror groups and more than 1 million people were displaced. That's more than twice as many as in 2018. So it has been a particularly difficult year, and after 7 years of international military engagement spearheaded by France in the region, the security situation does seem to be getting worse, not better.
Now, Macron had visited the region about a month or so ago, and he complained of a lack of clear political condemnation of anti-French feelings on the ground, and the fact that the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has recently, warned against terrorist groups who are gaining ground, and because of jihadist fighters stepping up their efforts or their campaign in the Sahel region. What do you think the French sentiment will be like going forward after this summit, and bearing in mind the UN Secretary General's statements or feelings about the Sahel region in general?
The 5 presidents that were present at this summit in Pau in the southwest of France and have signed this communiqué have gone out of their way to stress in the communiqué that they condemn anti-French sentiment in their own countries. France's involvement, of course, in its former colonies in West Africa has been controversial since they became independent, and there is a long history of what certainly some people in those countries would consider to be interference in their domestic politics. But in this communiqué, the presidents do say that they very much appreciate France's contribution to ensuring their security. The United Nations also says that it appreciates France's contribution in the Sahel and the necessity of trying to control Islamist-inspired terror groups in this part of the world in that communiqué. The problem, though, going forward is that it's hard to see how they can step up this military effort in a way that actually tackles the growing and very difficult to contain and control nature of the jihadi threat in the region. French troops are fairly limited in number over a vast expanse of land. The terror groups involved mostly are very familiar with the terrain, and they move very quickly using jeeps and things like that. They are very difficult for the French army even to track, let alone to combat. So the logistical challenges of operating in the Sahel desert are enormous, and it is hard to see how French troops can do a better job of fighting these jihadi groups than they have been doing so far.
Elena, thank you so much for your time. We'll leave it there for now. That was our correspondent in Paris, Elena Casas-Montanez, and she was joining us there live